And hello, dearest church family. I'm going to have a little toast here to you. I just wanted to express my love for all of you and my hope that each of you are safe, that you're all safe and healthy, and you know that God will guide us. God will guide us and support us and see us through this shocking historical event that we're all in the middle of. But I know that you can't possibly be happy. I know that for sure because, why? Because you haven't had the opportunity for me to offer you a hug, which I wish I could do, offer you a hug or a handshake. I know that you, like me, are missing the special experience of coming together in our church here for worship and for fellowship and for ministry in Jesus' name. And I, like you, have no idea when that will happen again. Soon, I pray. We wait and we see each day what the president says, and we pray and pray and pray. I truly miss seeing your smiling faces, hearing your precious voices, you know that. And I know from past years that our snowbirds, our seasonal guests and members may already be packing up and preparing for the journey to go north. It saddens me. It makes me sad. It disappoints me that I probably won't have the privilege to say goodbye and thank you all for all you do for Living Waters. But we're so thankful for how you are so faithful in your sharing of your time, your talents, and your treasure. But most of all of your love that you share as well. Indeed, the Living Waters family is pretty darn special, isn't it? It's truly our home away from home. I've heard that over and over again. And I miss you all a bunch. So the Lord be with you, and the peace of the Lord be with you as well. And now I want to share with you the Holy Gospel of St. John, the Gospel for this coming Sunday. It's John 11, 1 through 45. It's a lengthy Gospel text, so I'm going to be lubricating my throat as I read this lesson. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord, as you know, with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Accordingly, though, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. And having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. And then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews are just now trying to stone you. And are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble, because they see the light of this world. But those who walk at night stumble, because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to awaken him." And the disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will be all right." And Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought he was referring merely to sleep. And then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the Twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." And when Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Mary and Martha to console them about their brother. And when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and she met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." And when she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and he's calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and she went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were there in the house consoling her saw Mary get up quickly and go out, and they followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" And they said to him, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" And then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. And Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there's a stench because he's been dead 4 days." And Jesus said to her, "Didn't I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" And the dead man came out, his hands and his feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary had seen what Jesus did and believed in him. And this is the gospel of our Lord. Thanks be to God. Now, I think most of us, if not all of us, have had big dreams and big hopes and huge plans at some times in our lives that have been erased, that have been lost, that have been buried in a grave, so to speak, and never to be seen again. And whether it was from a failed marriage, a divorce possibly, or a broken relationship with a son or daughter, or maybe even a personal bankruptcy, or maybe a chronic illness or a loss of employment or some other handicap that suddenly made life so difficult. And in what I'm doing, I'm speaking of those times, folks, when we can no longer do what we used to be able to do. I'm talking about where where an abundantly rich life has suddenly become empty and barren. And yes, I believe this is what those first moments must have felt like to Mary and Martha as they stood near their brother's grave. And I know there isn't a single person who's listening to me right now that cannot remember or possibly understand the emotions of that moment. Your world is changed forever. Am I right? Well, sisters and brothers, the gospel lesson today teaches us. It powerfully reminds us that the road to Easter makes its way through a cemetery. For earlier in the Gospel of St. John, we learned that the two sisters, Mary and Martha, had done much for Jesus. When the world was turning against Christ, it had been Mary who anointed the Lord, if you recall, with costly perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. We remember that point, that moment. It was Mary and it was Martha who had provided Jesus shelter whenever he needed it during his travels with his disciples. And now the sisters had sent word to their friend Jesus of their brother Lazarus' illness, and despite the fact that they thought they'd gone the extra mile, despite the fact that they saw themselves as good folks, their brother Jesus' friend Lazarus had been struck with a deadly illness. And I'm quite sure they were all like all of us, and they were asking that question. Why? But as in so many times in life, what appears to be an ending can in fact become a beginning. Where we only see failure, God can open a new door, and where we feel abandoned, God draws near and helps us to find hope and assurance. And folks, that's what this powerful lesson in the Gospel of John teaches us as we continue to walk with Christ to the cross during the season of Lent. That even though we make our way through the reality of loss and defeat and disappointments, there is indeed a power. There's a power in this world that's stronger than death. And so we're reminded by the living Word of God of who it is that has the last word, so to speak. But before we get to the last word, 4 days have now passed since the death and burial of Lazarus. And we can see the sorrow in this text. We can see the sorrow and the grief that has absolute control over Mary and Martha's lives. And Martha confronts Jesus with the fact that if he had been there when Lazarus was dying, it would not have ever happened. And when Jesus attempts to comfort her by saying, I am the resurrection and the life, and that Lazarus will live again, she doesn't understand him. She doesn't understand him at all. She took his words to kind of be a theological statement, not a promise about the present time. Indeed, she had a belief in the theological promise, but that wasn't going to heal her broken heart. Jesus was not there in their time of need. When their brother was dying, Jesus delayed his return. And so now we see the courage. Now we see the courage and the wisdom of Jesus and how he deals with the pain and the grief of Mary and Martha. And I say courage, dear friends, because as we heard in the text, there was a risk for Christ to go back to be with them. He was warned that there were some there that were seeking to stone him still. But Christ wouldn't allow the fear of others or anything else to keep him from going where he was needed. And then to most of us, Thomas has been labeled as the doubter, but as we read, it is Thomas who speaks up, and Thomas says, let us go also, so that we may die with him. So Thomas the doubter was demonstrating the power of faith even on a road that leads through a cemetery. So the 4 days had passed since the death and burial of Lazarus, and now I guess that leads us to a time that I guess I would call casserole time. That is, the neighbors and the friends who had gathered in Mary and Martha's home to console them probably most likely brought food. Maybe even some green Jello salad, who knows. And so when Mary responded to the invitation of Jesus to follow him to the grave, all of those folks, after they had their casseroles, went with her. Now this scene reminds us that neighbors, caring for neighbors, the church family, caring for church family, are indeed good folk, whatever their faith. An important lesson. Now when Mary joined them as well, and when she saw Jesus, she again repeated the same words that her sister said. If you had been here, we wouldn't be going through this. But this time it was said with tears. And Jesus' heart was broken. And in that moment, we really truly get a glimpse of the humanity of Christ. The humanity of Jesus of Nazareth. As he begins to cry. As John wrote, Jesus wept. He had lost a dear friend, and he indeed could see and feel the grief of two other dear friends. And yes, indeed, there are times in our lives when the best thing that we can do for another is just to cry with them. Not try to find the right words, but just cry with them. Because his tears expressed empathy and his compassion and his love. His tears expressed his broken heart. But in contrast, the crowd's reaction was kind of mixed. Even though they saw the tears of Christ, they are asking themselves, if Jesus could give sight to the blind man, why couldn't he have kept his friend from dying? Now, folks, you and I know that when our hearts are broken, there is rarely any answer that will heal the hurt. But then Jesus asked for the stone to be removed from the grave, and Martha, the practical sister, questioned his command. She reminded Jesus that Lazarus had been dead for 4 days, and there would be a very pleasant odor. And it's interesting, we use the Revised Standard Version that says, there is already a stench. But it's interesting that the King James Version, which is usually more poetic in its translation, what does that say? It says, he would stinketh. He would stinketh. But Jesus knew that if the world was going to experience the glory of God, this was a time to move beyond the boundaries of this stinketh. So the stone was removed. So now comes the moment. Now comes the moment when Jesus calls Lazarus to come out, and can you even imagine what the crowd was thinking? Can you imagine? Of course, the crowd wasn't sitting in the pews at Living Waters Lutheran, were they? Think about that. When Lazarus came out, the crowd probably wished they were sitting in some pews, because the dead man was walking. And now the road to Easter had reached a very important turn in the road. When others saw this man who had been dead and buried come back to life, they would become believers in the one who had such power to call him from his grave. In fact, the gospel writer John says, it is said that many of the Jews that had come out to be with the sisters saw what Jesus had done and believed. So in that moment, dear friends, We know that the world will not have the last word. You and I will not have the last word, but God will have the last word. And with His word, there are new beginnings and new possibilities. Yes, in order to experience the joy and the hope of Easter, folks, we must go indeed through the cemeteries of our disappointments, the cemeteries of our defeats and our losses. And when we experience the power, the amazing grace of Jesus Christ in our lives, those stones of bitterness, those stones of disappointment and sorrow are rolled away, so we can move past that stinketh and live life at its fullest. So sisters and brothers, this miracle is a symbol of what God, it's a symbol of what God can do for us today. When Jesus, for example, was in the boat with his disciples and the storm threatened their lives, he said, "Peace, be still." And he calmed the sea. And dear friends, God is promising us that in any storm, Jesus can give confidence and calmness. He does indeed still the storms of our lives. So now as you're sitting in your living rooms, maybe in your favorite chair, or maybe you're even lying on your comfortable bed, perhaps inside your soul, perhaps inside your soul, though it isn't comfortable right now, because there's a stone of bitterness or a stone of disappointment or sorrow or hopelessness. So I ask you now, can the stones be rolled away? Can you come out? The answer is yes. The world will not have the last word. We will not have the last word. Sisters and brothers, God will have the last word. And so may you move past the stinketh and be filled with God's goodness and grace this day.